Hi everyone. In this example, I want to show you how you can create a pivot table using Visual Basic. The use case is very obvious. While pivot tables are not difficult to create, it is a repetitive task. And if you are creating a pivot table at the end of, let us say, every week or every journey cycle, it does take a lot of time. And because it is a repetitive task, it is probably the best example where we can port the process over to Visual Basic so that we can fully automate it. That offers a lot of advantages. One is that it reduces the time taken. It enables you to spend more time on the insight. You can transfer your learning to other people in your team. And also the amount of effort you put in formatting, sometimes we find it difficult to recreate the same pivot style multiple times. So it is easy to do that. Now this video is going to be a little long since I'm going to help you write the entire code with me. And the reason I'm not just explaining it by giving you the solution at a high level, but rather I'm going to deep dive with you and tell you how to write the entire code is because I feel you need to know how the entire code works. Real life is not simple. Even if I give you the code, you will not be able to use it with a copy and paste in your own workflow unless and until you know how to tweak it. And tweaking it is of paramount importance. And that is why I would suggest not just to copy and paste the code, because that might work one time, but then this is a good opportunity for you to learn a little bit of Visual Basic as well. This is the data set with which we are working. I have 20 records. Then I also have these 10 columns with me. There are no errors, no null values in the data. We have the order date, customer name, region, market, category, segment, subcategory, sales quantity, and profit. The first thing I wanted to do is to call this my data sheet. And let us go to developer and Visual Basic, and I will insert a module. The first thing I want to do is to create a subroutine where I say I want to create a pivot table. First, let's declare the variables. So first, I will say that my pivot sheet, which I'm going to call as pivot underscore sheet. This is the sheet on which the pivot table will be created. So this is a worksheet. Then I'm also going to create my data sheet. This is the sheet which has the data in it. So this would be data underscore sheet as worksheet. Then we also want to create a pivot cache. And this would be as a pivot cache. The logic of the pivot cache is that once you select the data and you create a pivot table, there is a step in the middle. So first a pivot cache is created from the data set, and the pivot cache is used to create the final pivot table. When you generally create a pivot table, you don't realize this, but in Visual Basic, this 1, 2, 3 step is important. Take the data, put it in the pivot cache, and then create a pivot table. And then I will also say my pivot range, which is a range, and then 2 numbers. So one would be for my last row, let it be long, and then again for my last column, which is also long. First, we want to insert a new blank worksheet. And we will say here application dot display alerts is equal to false. We are doing this to optimize the code and to make sure that there is no screen flickering that happens. After this, we want to say worksheets. And I will say my pivot sheet dot delete. Now the logic here is that we are going to create a sheet called pivot sheet. But what if the sheet is already there and you want to refresh the pivot table? That means the existing pivot sheet has to be deleted. That is why we are doing worksheets pivot sheet dot delete. Then we will say sheets dot add before, and this would be my active sheet. So we are adding a sheet before my active sheet. So I assume here that data underscore sheet is the sheet that has data in it. This is where I run the macro from, and we simply want to add a sheet before this. Now we have to give it a name. So we will say active sheet dot name is equal to my pivot sheet, like this. And then we can also make this application dot display alert is equal to true. Now, if I try to run the code, let us see what happens. So let us go to developer and macros, and we will click on run, and it gives me an error. The reason is that it is trying to delete a sheet that does not even exist. And that's why the problem is happening. That is why we will have to put an error handler, and we will simply say on error, resume next. So this is our way of saying that if there is no sheet called the pivot sheet, and we are creating a pivot sheet for the first time, I would like to skip this step, or rather the step will run, but if it gives me an error, I would like to ignore the error and move forward and then create a new sheet called the pivot sheet. Let us see what happens now. So now when I go to macros and I click on run, you will see that a pivot sheet has been created. Let me just put some values here. Now, if I again come back to macros and I go to run, think what will happen. It will first delete the existing pivot sheet and then create a new one. So when I click on run, you will notice it deletes the current pivot sheet and creates a new one. All right. Once we have done this, we can also set our display alerts back to true. Remember to always do this. Once you set the display alerts to false, it's a toggle, but it becomes permanent. And you always have to remember, if you turn it off, turn it back on before you continue. Now I want to set my pivot sheet is equal to worksheets, and I will say pivot sheet. So I'm essentially giving a name to that sheet that we have created, the pivot sheet. And then similarly, we will say set my data sheet to the sheet that we already have, which is called data. In fact, let's make it data sheet without the underscore. So we'll make it data sheet. The reason we have given two names is because it's easier for us to refer to these names rather than have to write worksheets pivot sheet and worksheet data sheet every time. Now we want to define the data range. So first we have our last row, and then we have our last column. So the last row will be nothing but my data sheet, and then we say dot cells, and then we say rows dot count, comma 1 dot end, and then Excel up dot row. So let me explain what is happening. I want to know that 21st row is the last row that has a value in it. Now, how do I know it is the 21st row? We will first go to A1048576. So the last row in column A. And from there, we will press Control up to go back. And that enables me to find out that 21 is the last row that we have. That is what we are trying to recreate here. I'm saying that in my sheet called the data sheet, in my cells, rows.count, comma 1. I could have written 1048576, comma 1 as well. And then I'm doing end excelup.row, which is nothing but control up. Now, how do we know that the result is correct? If I can just put a message box for a moment, and I can say message box last row, and I click on run. Okay, that gives me an error. So let me just comment it out. You notice it tells me 21, which is the result that we wanted. So we can do the same thing for the column as well. So I'll copy the same thing. And this time the only difference will be that we will have to make it columns.count, and we will say Excel left, or rather Excel to left. That is the correct way of doing this. And this would be dot column. Let us also make sure that we are getting the correct results. There's no harm in checking that. So I'm going to copy this one more time. So last row and last column, let me run it. So it tells me 21 and 1. So you notice the result that we would have liked is 21 and this one, column J being the 10th column that we have. So let us see what we have to change here. I will have to change this to 1, comma, columns.count. So essentially I'm saying that in the first row, go to the last column, that would be 16,384, and then press Control left arrow to find out the last column number. So it tells me 21 and 10. All right, so let's remove this. Next, what we would like to do is to set my pivot range. So now that we know the data is ending on the 21st row and the 10th column, we can set a pivot range, and we will simply write here that in my data sheet, I would like to select from the cell 1, comma 1, which is nothing but the cell A1, and dot resize, and we will say last row, comma last column, like this. Essentially what we are doing is we are selecting from A1 till the last row and the last column. So 21, comma 10, the 21st row and the 10th column, like this. Let me see if I can show you how to validate the result as well. So let me just make pivot underscore range dot address. Let's give that a shot. So let me run it. So we go to macros and we run it. Okay, that did not work. So let me see what other way would be there to be able to confirm to you that we have selected the right thing. So I'm not quite sure how to confirm to you that the result is correct, but let's continue with the code and perhaps we'll be able to come back to it. Now that we have the data range, let us also define my pivot cache. And this would be set my pivot cache. And pivot cache will be equal to my active workbook dot pivot caches dot create, and then I will say my source type is equal to Excel database, and my source data is equal to my pivot range. And we will also say, now we want to create a pivot table from this, and my table destination will be equal to my pivot sheet. And in the pivot sheet, we are selecting the cell 1, 1, comma, and we want to give a table name as well. So let me give a table name, which is equal to my sales pivot table sales. Let's keep it as pivot table sales, like this. Let me just quickly check if everything has been done correctly. Everything seems okay. Let us try to move forward. And if there is an error, we'll try and fix it. One suggestion I'll give you is to break it into multiple lines since the code is quite long. So to make your life a little easier, what we can do is to break this into 3 lines like this. And let's not start on 1, 1. Let's start at 2, 2, which essentially means we are putting it in B2, right? Like this. And like this. Okay, looks a lot better. All right, now that we have the pivot cache, let us also insert a blank pivot table. So insert blank pivot table. And for this, we will set my pivot table, which is equal to my pivot cache. And we will say create pivot table. And we will say my table destination is equal to my pivot sheet dot cells 1, 1, and my table name is equal to pivot table sales, like this. Okay, let's give it a shot. So macros and then run, and that did not seem to work. So let me also try to put some values in it. Let me go through the code one more time. I think I made a small mistake here. So let's make this last column with a capital C. Let's also make it last column. And we will also select message box. And we will say pivot underscore range dot address. And I notice it is working, right? So very small mistake. We had to make this small change. So last column and last column. Excellent. Now let's continue with the rest of the code. So let us see if other things look okay. Let's give it a shot. Let me make sure everything is deleted. We will go to insert. Go to developer, macros, and then run. And it gives me an error. It says worksheets pivot sheet dot delete is not working. Okay, I think my on error resume next has been commented out. So let me run it one more time. And you can see that a pivot table has been created. And if you go to the pivot table analyze option, You will also see the name of the pivot table is here, pivot table sales. So this is the name that we had given here, which is my pivot table sales. So we have found the last row, the last column. We have selected from A1 till the 21st row and the 10th column. We have created a pivot cache and we have created a blank pivot table. And of course, what we want to do now is to populate the rows and the columns, right? So we will insert our row field first. So insert our row fields. And here we will say that with my active sheet selected. So with active sheet dot pivot tables. And which pivot table are we selecting? The one that we have created, which is pivot table sales. We would like to make pivot fields, and I'm going to select my market here. And that gives me an error. Let me check that. So with my active sheet dot pivot tables, that seems to give me an error as well. Okay. So with my active sheet pivot tables, we are selecting market, and I'm also going to select the orientation, and this will be Excel row field, and that is self-explanatory. We are putting it in the rows, and we are also saying dot position is equal to 1. The position is helpful when you want to keep multiple values in the rows. And then let me copy the same thing, and now we'll create our column as well. And in the column, we will say that everything else remains the same, but let me select something else. So I'm going to select my category. And the category, we're going to put it in the column field. Right? And yeah, I think that's good enough. And then let's put our data as well. So our data fields. And here we will want to select our sales value, and we will put it in the data field. And this time we also want to write a function here. So we will say dot function is equal to Excel sum. And then we can also give it a number format. And I'm just going to make this number format very simple. We'll just put it as 0 semicolon 0. And then we also want to give it a name. And we will give it a name of sales. That is it. And what else can we do? Let us also format our pivot table. In fact, before doing that, let's check if everything is working properly. So now when we go to developer and run the macro, create pivot table, you will see that it creates a pivot table, puts the market in the rows, the category in the column, and we have the amount as well. As you would expect, it is showing us the sum of all the sales values. But if you wanted to show the average, for example, then I can just run my macro one more time, and now it shows me the average value like this. And then one final thing that I want to show you is how to format the pivot table as well. So we will say that with my active sheet dot pivot tables, and we're going to select our pivot table sales. We will say show table style row stripes is equal to true. And then let's also change the table style here. So we will say dot table style 2 is equal to, and I'm just going to choose pivot style medium 9 like this. You can find all this in the documentation. And let us see how it works now. I simply go to macros and I click on run. And as you can see, the formatting has also happened. But here's the best part. Right now, we only have 20 records with us. Imagine that I remove a few of these like this. Let us see what will happen. Let me first make sure to copy it in a different workbook, because once I run the code, I'll not be able to press Ctrl Z. But as you can see, now we only have 10 records. And if I create a shape, and on the shape, we can assign a macro for the pivot table. When I click on it, you notice it works. One more time, I just have to come back and add some data here. And we run our code once again. So developer macros and run, and it works. So there you go, everyone. In this example, I've shown you how to use VBA to create a pivot table. It does take a little bit of time to set everything up, but it's not really difficult because you don't really have to write most of it. You can just copy and paste it and make the modifications as required. Obviously, if you want to do it in a different scenario, for example, creating a pivot table on the same sheet, or creating multiple pivot table, creating slices, you will have to write a few more lines of code. But the basic concept has been explained to you: how to find the last row, the last column, select everything from 1, 1 till the last cell, create a pivot cache, create an empty pivot table, and then populate the row, columns, field, and so on and so forth.